Seated. I welcome all of you, especially those watching on live stream or by tape version. On behalf of the Church of the Heavenly Rest, I extend my deep gratitude to Ken and Lee, to all the clergy and bishops of the Cathedral, all their staff. The hospitality has been extraordinary. And Church of the Heavenly Rest, welcome to our sister brother church up the way. It feels like we're on a field trip today, a little pilgrimage. We're so glad to be in this special place. Thank you, Ken and Lee. 96 years ago, an event happened in this world that captured the entire globe. On May 20th, 1927, Charles Lindbergh, the lone eagle, successfully flew across the Atlantic by himself. It was an astounding event, one that caused this city to break for a number of hours, and as has been done many times before, down Lower Broadway to have a ticker tape parade. Millions of people were mesmerized by this event. 91 years ago, this past March, there was another experience in the Lindbergh family, one that also captured the imagination and the heartache of the nation, and that is Charles Lindbergh Jr., as an infant, was kidnapped out of his crib, stolen from the family house, and during the ensuing days, the mother, Anne Morrow Lindbergh, was in total grief, total chaos, as they searched diligently for Charles Lindbergh Jr. About a week into this trauma, they found, sadly, Charles Lindbergh Jr. dead. About 40 years after the baby's death, Anne Morrow Lindbergh then recorded all of these events in a 2-volume memoir called Hour of Gold, Hour of Lead. Her hour of gold, of course, was Charles's solo flight, the glorious majesty of that event. And then she had an hour of lead, when the worst thing that could happen to a mother happened. A mother's child is murdered. During those coming months, as she recorded these things, she began to get in touch with the miraculous gift of forgiveness. Forgiveness. That incredible gift that God gives us. But we'd all have to say that while it's miraculous, it's terribly difficult, this gift from God. Hannah Arendt, as she was writing about the Holocaust in her book, The Human Condition, writes this: "Forgiveness is God's invention for coming to terms with a world in which, despite their best intentions, people do damage to each other. God began forgiving us," Hannah Arendt writes, and God invites us then to forgive each other. Well, the parable that we have before us on this September the 17th from Matthew chapter 18 is a clear example of getting into this great gift from God. Jesus tells a parable after Peter asks him about forgiveness. He said there was a king who came upon one of his servants, and that king forgave that servant a 10,000 talent debt. Do you know what that is in today's money? That's $20 million. The king forgave him $20 million upon receiving that forgiveness. Then that same servant went out and found one of his fellow servants and did not forgive him a debt that's comparable to $12 in today's money. One who was forgiven $20 million was unable to forgive one who had a $12 debt. One of the challenges of this text, of course, is that you and I have a hard time believing in the fathomless forgiveness of God. We somehow don't believe it. We don't believe it's true that you and I could receive abounding forgiveness day by day and that the world could receive the same. We think that somehow we need to earn something or to get to the place where we deserve something. And yet this forgiveness is given to us. And I want you to imagine for a moment now how this forgiveness works, not only in the birth, life, teaching, but then in the death of Jesus of Nazareth, when he offers himself in unconditional love and says to each of us from the cross, I forgive you. There's not anything that you can possibly imagine this side of heaven that can cause me not to forgive you. And God doesn't wait for us to purify ourselves. God begins to forgive us before there's any sign of us that's worthy of forgiveness. To believe that then leads us into the second place of the parable, and that is how you and I can forgive each other. How can we twist and turn this gift so often in our lives where you and I are given unconditional forgiveness, and yet we turn around and want to throw one of our friends, one of our fellows, into debtor's prison for $12? I don't know how you and I twist and turn this gift, but we're past masters at it. Anne Lamott, who's one of my favorite authors, she's salty, by the way, so I warn you, if you pick her up, then be ready. Anne Lamott writes, I went around saying for a long time that I'm not one of those Christians who is heavily into forgiveness, that I'm one of the other kind. That is, if you do me wrong, if you make me suffer, watch out. But even though it was ironic and actually true, it started to be too painful to stay this way. She writes, by the time I decided to become one of those who's heavily into forgiveness, it was like trying to become a marathon runner in middle age. I tried to will myself into forgiving various people who had harmed me along the way, but in the end, I could only pretend to do so. I decided I was starting with my sights a bit too high. As C.S. Lewis says, if we really want to learn how to forgive, perhaps we had better start with something easier than the Gestapo. So I decided to start with someone I barely knew, whom I had only hated for a few months. It's a long story, Anne Lamott writes, but the gist of it is this. I finally got it. The veil dropped one day when I realized that I was mad as a hatter and that my lack of forgiveness was being matched by her unfailing love towards me. It was like a faucet that was already flowing with thirst-quenching water before I had a chance to hold out my cup to be filled up. It was that day, she writes, that I decided to be a person of forgiving. Part of the problem is you and I become so legalistic. We do bean counting about forgiveness, don't we? We keep score. We love to keep score in our equations and relationships. You may know the girl who was taught by her mother, who had a brother who kept bothering her, that when Peter asked, how often should I forgive my brother? 7 times? No, 77 times. Well, the next week, the brother broke her doll baby again, and her mother heard the daughter whisper, that's 36 times. The lack of forgiveness, the withholding of absolution causes deep pain in our world. When you and I do not come to terms with this great gift of God, we continue to linger, don't we? Both in memory and in pain. In addition to our legalism, however, there's also the matter of perspective. How we focus on the $12 is besides me, instead of the $20 million gift that's given to us. I find this particularly true in family life. Whether you're single and have a whole cadre of friends, or whether you're like me and you have a partner or a spouse and children, it can happen right there at home, can't it? I discovered a number of years ago, I have 3 daughters, that as we were raising our daughters, I realized something very chastening, and that is I spent about 95% of my waking energy worrying and fretting over the 5% of the girls that I didn't feel so good about. And I spent about 5% of my waking energy on the 95% that was going glorious. Now, I have to say, parenthetically, that I think I'm more the rule than the exception. I think I have a lot of company. We lose our perspective, don't we? Spending enormous amounts of time and energy on this much of what is not going well. I encourage us to turn the equation, to get the $20 million and the $12 in perspective. So how do we find our perspective? Where do we go to discover this gift so that you and I can be people of forgiveness? Again, I invite us to look at the cross, that empty cross where God says to us in life, there's not anything, nothing you can do to keep me from forgiving you. I love you always. There's not anything that you can do to quench that love. You may know Ursula Heggie. She's written a very important novel called Stones from the River. The main character, she calls her a dwarf. Her name is Trudy Montag. Trudy lives in a small German town. When we first meet her in Ursula Heggie's novel, she's hanging from a doorpost by her feet, trying to stretch herself because she's received so much ridicule and personal damage. She's been excluded from everything in her culture. So she's trying in vain to change herself by stretching herself. In ridicule and derision, she considers herself in the company of, as she says, children who are overweight, who are slow, who are poor, and who are homely. That's where, she says, I find my company. But the author tells us that Trudy Montag also has a deep heart and wise eyes. Did you hear that? She has a deep heart and wise eyes. The second half of the novel describes then Trudy as an adult. The Nazis have already taken over her small German town. They're already in power, and they're ruthlessly seizing her Jewish friends who live in her neighborhood. Trudy is appalled. She's not only horrified at what happens to her Jewish friends, but she's horrified at her Christian friends who go to local churches who are supportive of the Third Reich. She begins to open up her home. She says, I know what it is to be an outcast. She opens up her basement to her Jewish friends, hiding them again with great danger to herself. As she huddles one night with her friends in the basement, this is what she writes in her journal. I feel dizzy with the longing for peace and forgiveness. The same way I felt as a child. More than anything, I want the differences between people to matter no more. I wish for love and harmony and forgiveness to reign. So let me ask you this morning, as I ask myself, who needs your forgiveness? Will they get it? Who needs to forgive you? Will you receive it? A $20 million forgiveness or a $12 grudge? An hour of gold or an hour of lead? Concentrating on the 5% that you don't feel so good about, or celebrating the 95% you celebrate? Imprisonment or freedom? Peter asked Jesus, how often do I have to forgive my neighbor? As many as 7 times? Jesus said, oh no, 77 times. In other words, in all of our life, over and over and over again. Amen.